Well, all right, XPhys class. Well, we're going to start with where we left off in the synchronous class on Wednesday. And this was the slide that you guys had gone in your breakout rooms and discussed a little bit. And this kind of gets at the underlying mechanisms of how stroke volume changes in response to training. Okay, so we look at both EDV, ESV, and ejection fraction, right? So EDV, again, is our measure of preload. And this could really be dictated by two things, right? This could really be dictated by internal diameter of the ventricle, right? Because that's really just going to be how much room is there for blood. Okay, if there's more room, then we can have a higher EDV, right? But it's also going to be dictated by how much blood. How much blood do we have? And those are the changes we see in blood volume that I'll discuss in one sec. Okay. So just at rest, what do we see? We see quite an increase just at rest, right? We see going from about 135, maybe up to 160, okay? So we've got like a 25 mil increase at rest, okay? That maintains it at low intensity exercise, maintains at moderate intensity exercise, goes even higher at very intense exercise, okay? So we see a big increase in EDV, okay? That's again due to the increase in internal diameter, so there's more room for blood, and then the increase in blood itself because there is more blood, okay? What about ESV? ESV is what's left over in the heart after contraction, right? So we see the post-training one in purple here again. We see at rest that there's actually a little bit more left over than there was before training, okay? But what we see is that difference between what's left over before and after training is much smaller than the difference that we started with, right? This was about we said that was about a 25 mil increase. This is only about a 10 mil decrease, right? So we actually end up having more blood ejected, okay? So stroke volume obviously still went up, okay? What about as we move forward? So as we move forward, we see a similar situation, but even closer there at lower intensity exercise. Now we see a little bit of a shift happening. Now we see less blood left over, and then maximal exercise, even less blood left over. And this is the remarkable one, right? Because we end up with only about 35 mils left in here, but we started with about 175, right? So our stroke volume there would be about 140. Okay, whereas our stroke volume here was about 45, sorry, 145. And then here, let's call it 45 to make it easy. Okay, so about 100, right, stroke volume. Okay, so we have a 40 mil increase in stroke volume at max there. Okay, and we can see how that's driven by end diastolic volume, which we said was internal diameter and blood volume, but then it's also driven by less end systolic volume. So it's not only that we started with more blood, that's the end diastolic volume, but even with more blood, we still got more blood out, okay? And that's going to be driven mainly by contractility. Okay, and how do we see that? Well, we see it right here, right? The percentage of blood getting ejected at maximal exercise went from 68 up to about 78. So we had about 10% increase in efficiency. Obviously, that one's showing contractility as well as this one, right? So those are our two big things that increase in stroke volume. We talked about that with acute exercise too, right? We got preload, afterload, contractility. We know afterload didn't help us much, but preload did. We had more preload, that helped our stroke volume. And then we had more contractility because we had more sympathetic nervous system activation in acutely, but we'll talk about, we already did talk about how it happened chronically, right? It happened because we had better calcium troponin interaction. We actually do have more sympathetic nervous system activity, so we're going to have more calcium influx due to that as well. Okay, so how does stroke volume change with training? We have an increase in EDV, we have a decrease in ESV, and we have an increase in ejection fraction. Okay, so important to be able to kind of look at that and analyze those graphs. Okay, so just a kind of a review question here. In most cases after training program, maximal ventilation is increased, resting, no change, okay, and submaximal would be decreased. So we got all three here, right? So increased, unchanged, and decreased. So that's D. Okay, another review question here. Which of the following factors are responsible for the increase in stroke volume due to training? Well, we see increased plasma volume for sure. Talked about that one. Increased cardiac contractility, left ventricular chamber size. This is the diameter one, right? Increased EDV. We haven't talked about it yet, but increased red blood cell volume, definitely, and increased left ventricular wall thickness. All of these for sure. Okay, so let's talk about peripheral blood flow. So we talked about central blood flow, talked about ventilation. Now let's talk about peripheral blood flow. All right, so hypervolemia. This is a key one, right? This is that blood volume increase, okay? So 20 to 25% larger volume increase the 20 to 25% larger blood volume in endurance trained people compared to untrained, okay? But the remarkable thing about this one is it's fast. We can have a 10% increase in only 8 to 10 days of training. Okay, so how does this happen? Well, it happens with two mechanisms. Okay, it starts out with exercise causes an increase in blood pressure. Right? If we increase blood pressure, we actually push what is called PPs, plasma proteins, out of capillaries. Okay, plasma proteins are what maintain our osmotic pressure in the blood, which is what helps us hold on to fluid in the blood, okay? So if that high blood pressure pushes some plasma proteins out, the liver, who's responsible for making plasma proteins, senses, oh shoot, we've got less plasma proteins than we used to, I better make some more, okay? So I better make some more, so the liver starts synthesizing more, sends those new plasma proteins out into the blood, but then the lymphatic system comes in as the hero here. Lymphatic system will eventually get all those plasma proteins that were lost back into the bloodstream, okay? So we get an increase in plasma proteins. How? Because the liver puts more back in, okay? And then let's do it this way. Not more back in, but put them back, right? The lymphatic system puts them back. The ones that were pushed out get put back. And then the liver synthesizes more. Okay, so we get more plasma proteins, okay? And because of this, we get increased osmotic pressure in the blood. So that means the blood can now hold on to more fluid. It has the ability to do that, okay? But that's not all we need. We actually need our kidneys to stop releasing so much fluid too, right? And so that's where we see an increase in ADH and aldosterone. Okay, so we got to work at it from those two mechanisms. More plasma proteins so we can increase osmotic pressure, and then secondly, active the kidneys to hold on to more fluid. How does this affect thermoregulation? Obviously, it increases the ability to thermoregulate, okay? Because when we start getting hot, when we exercise, we send blood to skin, right? Talked about this before. We send blood to the skin to help us cool, to help us sweat, but also just help us get blood to the surface. And normally when we do that, we do that at the sacrifice of stroke volume, right? Because we're sending more blood to the periphery, so we have less venous return. Okay, but if we have more blood, then we can send blood to the skin and maintain central blood flow. So we can maintain, say right here, we can maintain stroke volume. The heart rate doesn't have to. Heart rate doesn't have to increase. Okay, so that's the blood volume one. All right. Okay, but that was just one part of the blood, right? That was just the plasma volume. So we see that increase here. We see 2.8 liters to 3.3 liters of plasma volume, okay? But that doesn't account for our total blood volume change, right? We go from 5 liters to 5.7. This is only a 0.5 change in plasma volume. Where's that other 0.2? It's our red blood cells, right? Our red blood cells also have a 0.2 liter increase, okay? So that counts in our blood volume, right? So when we're exercising, okay, so we exercise, we have decreased O2 levels. If we're exercising intensely, at some point during exercise, we might have a little bit of decreased O2 in the blood. So the kidneys will sense that, right? they release erythropoietin. Erythropoietin goes to the red bone marrow, increases red blood cell production. We get some increased red blood cells. Okay, so it's not only that we increase plasma volume, but we also increase red blood cell volume. Okay, but look at hematocrit, right? Hematocrit is a percentage of the blood made up of red blood cells. It went from 44 to 42. Why does it go down? Well, it's because plasma volume goes up more than red blood cell volume. They both go up, but if plasma volume goes up more, then the percentage of red blood cells is actually going to go down, even though we have a more number of red blood cells, right? We have an increase in the number of red blood cells, but the percentage goes down. Important thing to remember. Okay, what about, so that's the blood itself. What about how we distribute the blood in our capillaries? Okay, this little table here shows it well. Okay, so we see capillaries per millimeter squared. We see muscle fibers per millimeter squared. We see capillary to fiber ratio. And most importantly, at the end, we see how far does oxygen have to diffuse out of the capillary to get to a muscle cell. Okay, so capillaries per millimeter, this is just like density of capillaries, right? Well-trained 640, untrained 600. So we have increase in capillary density, right? Capillary density increases, okay? What about how this is related to muscle fibers per millimeter squared? So well-trained people, there's less muscle fibers per millimeter squared than untrained. What does that have to do with? Well, that has to do with increasing, or just has to do with hypertrophy of type 1 fibers, right? If those fibers are bigger, then we have less of them for a certain amount of area, okay? All right, that doesn't apply too much to what we're talking about, but it is an interesting thing to note. And then what about capillary to fiber ratio? Okay, goes up, right? That's why that muscle fiber per millimeter squared is there, because capillary fiber to ratio goes up as well, okay? And that's important for that. But again, the bottom line is this. How far does oxygen have to go to get out of the capillary and to a muscle cell? That decreases. Okay, so decreased diffusion distance. That's key, right? If we can get oxygen to muscle cells faster, then we can use the oxidative system more effectively, right? So this would increase oxidative system usage. This would decrease anaerobic usage. So that's going to decrease lactate, right? That's going to increase lactate threshold, ventilation threshold, all of those things, right? It's really going to eventually let us exercise at a higher intensity sustainably, right? It's going to increase our maximal sustainable intensity. Important though. Okay, this is just kind of reiterating that a little bit more. Training can cause an increase in capillary density, microcirculation. So trained athletes have about 30% greater capillary density than sedentary. 2 months of endurance training, we can see a 50% increase in capillary density. Type 1 fibers are going to have the highest density, and this decreases diffusion distance, like I said. Okay, how would this affect AVO2 difference? Well, if we're extracting more oxygen from the blood, then we're going to increase AVO2 difference by decreasing the amount of oxygen on the venous side, because more got extracted as it went through. Okay, here's AVO2 difference. Some of the similar graphs we saw. Resting AVO2 difference, no change. Okay, what about maximal? We do see an increase in maximal. Okay, how does that happen? Well, we'll talk about it a little bit more on the TBL day, but it happens in multiple ways. Anything that's going to lead to more oxygen diffusion. Okay, so this would definitely be increased capillaries. Okay, this would be increased myoglobin. This would be increased mitochondria. So it's a lot of those same ones we had for the acute response, but we just are chronically increasing the number of mitochondria, chronically increasing the capillaries. Okay, we would have a rightward shift of the curve, right? We would do this even more extremely because we can push ourselves further into acidosis, okay? And those would be the main ones. Okay. All right. So to review the stroke volume, or to review these cardiovascular changes here, and I'm going to give myself my notes here so I don't forget what all 5 of those things are under stroke volume. Okay. So parasympathetic tone. What's all Fick equation there? How is heart rate able to go down at rest or at the same absolute intensity after training? That's because of the increase in stroke volume, right? Which allows for an increase in parasympathetic tone, okay? And that would give us a lower heart rate, okay? So if we increase stroke volume, that's going to be due to increased blood volume, which increases venous return, okay? We have left ventricular hypertrophy, right? That heart muscle is getting stronger. Okay, we have left ventricular chamber diameter increase. We have increased contractility. And at rest and submax, we have increased filling time. Okay, not at max. That's all related to heart rate, right? Heart rate is lower at rest, lower at submax, so we have more time to fill the heart, but not maximal, right? That maximal heart rate doesn't change. So microcirculation, we increase capillary density. Okay, why does this increase? Or what does this increase? Well, actually, this decreases diffusion distance, and what it increases is AVO2 difference. Okay, so we got our stroke volume increases, we got our AVO2 volume increases. All right, very important changes to know and understand. All right, let's dive into the muscle side of things now. So the active muscle metabolism, okay? So muscular adaptations. So we have type 1 fiber hypertrophy, okay? What does that do? That's going to be more oxidative system use, right? Increased myoglobin content. It's going to be increased diffusion of oxygen, increased number, size, and oxidative enzyme activity of mitochondria. So that increases mitochondrial capacity, which then increases oxygen diffusion. Okay, then we have some type 1 fiber switching, right? We go from some very non-oxidative fibers to some more oxidative type 2 fibers, and we can even go from type 2 to type 1. Okay, so that increases oxy system usage. Okay, now when I was running down the list of things to that show all the reasons why AVO2 difference changes, I forgot about this one, which is part of it, and I forgot about this one, which is also part of it. Okay, these two are all definitely part of it as well, but I had mentioned those. Okay, and then changes to glycogen storage, we increased glycogen. Okay, not related to the AVO2 difference, but it is related to something that happens in muscle, which is helpful for endurance performance. Okay, a few slides here just showing some of those specific enzymes that do change. So if we're looking at the Krebs cycle enzymes overall, with a control state, we take an arm or a limb and immobilize it. That's about a 30% decrease in Krebs cycle enzymes with immobilization. Do a little bit of moderate endurance training, we can have a 50% increase. Endurance athletes, we have a 300% increase. Okay. Chronic rabbit muscle stimulation, they just take that rabbit muscle out and just stimulate it like crazy. They see a 600% increase. So incredible capacity to increase these enzymes. Okay. One specific muscle in the Krebs cycle, succinate dehydrogenase. You can see that it's directly linked with overall muscle oxidative capacity, a nice linear relationship there. Okay. What do we see with succinate dehydrogenase, or SDH? We see same kind of things, right? So whole muscle going from detrained state to 4, untrained 7, endurance trained 11, endurance athlete 22. So we have this incredible increase of SDH activity. So how much can it increase from untrained to endurance athletes? Well, an incredible amount, right? That's a threefold increase. That's a 300% increase. That's a lot. Okay, what about oxidative enzymes in moderate intensity training? So just like your typical like light jog or brisk walk versus high intensity training. Okay, succinate dehydrogenase again, citrate synthase is another important mitochondrial enzyme. We see some increase with the moderate intensity training. We see even more increase with the high intensity training, right? So this is a place where intensity seems to matter. Okay, the higher intensity we do, the faster adaptations we have, and the more capability we have to use the oxidative system. So increased use of oxidative system. Okay, one of the key molecular regulators that I want you to know is called PGC1 alpha. Okay, if we can activate PGC1 alpha, and you guys look, we saw this with type 2 diabetes as well, and the mechanisms there. If we can activate PGC1 alpha, then we stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis. Okay, if we decrease activation of PGC1 alpha, then our mitochondria are weakened. So that's key. How do we activate PGC1 alpha? Okay, this one is looking at the muscle glycogen, right, that we talked about. So muscle glycogen storage goes up. How much does it go up? It goes up quite a bit. It can go up about 75%. We'll see that again here in a sec. Okay, so how much can mitochondrial enzyme activity increase? I showed you one that was about 300%, but in general, we expect about a doubling or about 100% increase in mitochondrial enzyme activity. And that's a lot, okay? But what's our expected increase in VO2 max? Well, that's only about 30%. Okay, so what does this say about those two? What it says is that VO2 max is not limited by mitochondria. Right? If VO2 max was limited by mitochondrial capacity, then we would see 100% increase in mitochondrial enzyme activity, just like we did, or we would see 100% increase in VO2 max, just like we did with the mitochondrial enzyme activity. Okay, so which variable? Now, we did this for acute changes, but what about for chronic changes? Which variable has the greatest capacity to increase from being untrained to trained? Okay, I would pause it and think about this one for a second. So we talked about stroke volume, talked about myoglobin, capillary density, overall mitochondrial capacity, and muscle glycogen. Okay, let's look here. So we see stroke volume change of about 25%, myoglobin about 75, capillary density about 50, mitochondrial capacity about 100, and muscle glycogen about 50. So which one has the greatest capacity to increase? For sure, the mitochondrial capacity. Okay, which one has the least? It's stroke volume, right? And that's pretty close to the 30% increase in VO2 max, right? So that makes sense that the one that increases the least is the one that holds up our VO2 max the most as well. There we go. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to stop it there, and we'll come back again on class on Monday for class, and I'll talk about this last part, which is more related to this top part, the performance velocity portion.